The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
So often you're writing about someone that no one's never heard of, or if you're a fiction writer, you're making up a character and you get to kind of form it. And one of the challenges of a biography of a famous person is to sort of you're meeting the reader's expectations and they're already sort of partially formed, which is, it's an interesting writerly problem.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Daniel Silliman is Senior News Editor for Christianity Today. He earned a doctorate in American Studies from Heidelberg University in Germany and has taught U.S. History and Humanities at Heidelberg, the University of Notre Dame, Valparaiso University, and Milligan University. His new book is One Lost Soul, Richard Nixon's Search for Salvation. That's right, a spiritual biography of Richard Nixon. To quote the jacket copy, impious and immoral, petty and vindictive, Richard Nixon is not the typical protagonist of a religious biography, but spiritual drama is at the heart of this former president's tragic story. Daniel Silliman, I'm so happy to have you on the Habit Podcast. I'm excited about talking about your biography of Richard Nixon. One Lost Soul. Do I have that title right?
Yeah. One Lost Soul, Richard Nixon, Search for Salvation.
So I was not expecting my bingo card for 2024 did not have a spiritual biography of Richard Nixon.
No one's did, except for mine, I suppose.
So
it's kind of a weird project.
What's that?
It's kind of a weird project. It's a little bit unusual. I mean, it's a little bit unusual for a spiritual biography. It's a little bit unusual for a presidential biography.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's lots and lots about Richard Nixon. If you want to read books about Richard Nixon, you can spend a bunch of time. But of course, he's a president. He's a politician. The main interest people have is his political development. People aren't sort of interested in plumbing his soul or thinking about him for purposes of spirituality. And then on the other hand, like religious biographies, that's a robust genre as well. Yeah. But what's interesting over there is that it's not unheard of, but pretty unusual to have religious biographies of people who are, not to put too fine a point on it, bad. Right? It tends to be something like, here's an important religious leader, here's an important religious figure, almost, if you go trace the genre back, you get to saints' hagiographies.
Yeah, right.
Or there's really common in the genre to have like, here is a great leader, And also he was devout, and part of his greatness that you might not know on firsthand is his, piety and his spiritual life. And, he not only won the Civil War, he also prayed or something like that.
Yeah.
And so Nixon's weird in a couple of different ways. Or this book about Nixon is weird. He is also weird, but what I'm really saying is that it was an unusual project that I'm glad that people are coming along with me on this ride.
Yeah. So by the way, my earliest memory about politics was hearing that Richard Nixon had resigned. I was in Atlanta. My mother was taking like some sort of nursing test, and we were kicking around the Capitol, and somehow I heard about this. And so
you were like on the street, you heard it?
I think I was in the Capitol of Georgia, the Capitol building. That's the way I remember it. Who knows? I mean, memories weird, but I associate those things together. And I also had my grandparents, for some reason, had these cards about presidents with information about them. And I remember looking at Richard Nixon, and
like
one of the
flashcards.
What's that?
Like flashcards?
Well, they were like 8.5 by 11, as I remember. They're big, and so I remember reading that it said the person's religion, and I remember reading that he was Quaker, which didn't mean much to me at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But then the more I knew about Quakers, the less it sounded like Richard Nixon. So solve this mystery, Daniel.
How was he Quaker?
I mean, I just always assumed that he grew up Quaker and then he went off to be Richard Nixon.
Mm-hmm.
And and those two things were completely separate.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody grows up something. And then
sure. Yeah, and there is a little bit of that. I mean, he does not, as an adult, attend a Quaker church, though he is still officially a member of a Quaker church. He's only the member of one church his entire life, and it's the Quaker church he grew up in. But he doesn't attend that church really after his mother's funeral. So he's not, in daily practice. Another piece of the puzzle is sort of what people know about Quakers. So, you might know that they're pacifists. Nixon does not seem like a pacifist. He's famous for aggressively prosecuting the Vietnam War. You might know that they sit in silence. They don't have a designated preacher, but they wait until the Holy Spirit moves somebody to talk.
So you say they sit in silence. You don't mean they sit in brooding anger, that kind of silence.
Quiet. Yeah. Quiet until someone starts to quake. And that's, traditionally, if you go back, that was the origin of that name. And that's how you knew someone had a message directly from God. And people might know the image on the Quaker Oats box. Like that's sort of your typical Quaker thing. Quaker Oats image, incidentally, invented by a Presbyterian, had nothing to do with Quakers at all. But Nixon wasn't really a Quaker like that. His Quakerism was politically quite conservative. It had been influenced by revivalism. They identified as evangelical Quakers in the 1920s in Southern California when he was growing up. So it kind of looked like a Presbyterian church or a Methodist church. There was a choir, there was preachers. Some of the old folks would still use the old language like thee and thou, but that wasn't really how it was for Nixon. So in some ways it looked fairly standard, fair, conservative Protestant when he grew up. And even the pacifist thing, it is historically a peace church, and Quakers traditionally have said that one of their sort of core testimonies of being followers of Jesus is that they turn the other cheek, that they reject all violence, and so on and so forth. But in his church, in World War I, they decided that it would be a matter of conscience, individual conscience, whether people chose to fight or chose to be conscientious objectors. And so the local Quaker college actually honored veterans alongside conscience. They actually had like side-by-side plaques at the college. And these are our boys who went to fight and what noble sacrifices they made. risking their lives for our country, and here are the people who refused to fight because of their commitment to Jesus and what noble sacrifice they made refusing to fight for their country. So that was kind of it looked a little different, I think, than people assume. Curiously, Nixon was happy for people to misunderstand that. He sort of accepted misunderstandings of that his whole life, and really never sought to clear up those misunderstandings, but actually kind of use them politically.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, you describe Richard Nixon as a lost soul searching for the love of God. You said he wanted to be loved by God, couldn't figure out how. So whatever the actual teaching of his church was, his version of whatever he received was what he learns,
and I don't totally want to saddle all of his pastors with responsibility for this, right? You can teach and you're not in control of what people hear.
That's right.
But what he heard from his church, from his Sunday school teacher, from his he went to church 3 times a week. There was a lot of sermons and a lot of messages, but what he learned was a gospel of works, theology of works. What he learned was that Quakerism and Christianity is about a kind of moral order, and it tells you how to be good, and it tells you have to work to be good. And if you are a really hard worker, you can win approval. What he didn't learn was grace, and if you go back, Martin Luther is emphasizing the importance of grace. The Quakers at their origin are emphasizing the importance of grace. All of those weird customs that start Quakerism, that distinguish Quakerism, really at their origin have this idea that like God speaks to each of us, and there's nothing you have to do to perceive the Holy Spirit. It's ready to you. It's right there if you just get the other stuff out of the way. And the revivalism that influenced his Quakerism that made it conservative, was the revivalism of Fanny Crosby, who sang about blessed assurance that Jesus is mine. And you don't have to wonder if God loves you. You don't have to wonder if you deserve salvation. God so loved the world that he gave his only son for Richard Nixon. But Richard Nixon didn't see it that way. He didn't accept it that way. He always believed he had to work to win approval. He had to work to win assurance. He had to work really to win the confidence that his existence was okay.
Yeah.
Right.
He was an incredibly hard worker. I mean,
he has an incredible work ethic, a very admirable work ethic, but it's underlined by a kind of continual anxiety and need to work.
What was it Henry Kissinger said, I'm sure you can quote this directly.
Yeah, he said,
who would have been if anybody had loved him? Is that what he said?
What a great man he would have been if only somebody had loved him. Which, of course, people did love him. It's an interesting. Kissinger's a funny person. He survives the Holocaust as a Jew growing up in Germany, escapes to America before the worst of the Holocaust, and then, becomes the master of realpolitik in American culture and becomes Nixon's foreign policy advisor. And he, I don't recommend you read his books. They're like thousands of pages of the most boring stuff ever. And then every once in a while, he has this sort of lightning strike of an insight where he just sees the truth of somebody. And Nixon in particular, he seems to be very perceptive. And he has this sense that the core problem with Nixon is that he can't receive love. And what he says is, if only somebody had loved him. But of course, there were people that loved him. I mean, he had a wife, he had parents, he had siblings, he had children. He had men around him throughout his career who cared so much for his vision and wanted to be on his side so much that they were willing to break the law and go to jail.
Yeah.
But the truth of what Kissinger is saying there is that he never could receive it. He never really saw it as unearned. You know, he thought his parents approved of him because he was a hard worker. He thought his wife and kids looked up to him because of what he had accomplished. He thought the men who would go to jail for him or the people who chanted his name were really seeing him as representative of a kind of agenda, and never could rest, never could have that assurance.
Yeah. I was struck by one moment that I found especially striking in your book was when he went to college and he had a college professor who kind of, in the class project was to, I don't know, kind of state your own beliefs. You know, the book, the essay I had to write was, what I can believe or whatever. And in the course of that process, he threw off he thought he was throwing off all the trappings of his growing up, and he wanted to believe in a Jesus shorn of all the miracles and the mysteries, and your point is he didn't really jettison any of his core religious beliefs, all of which were wrong and toxic. And his description of Jesus from the essay that you quote, Christ was for him the greatest man the world has ever known and an example for all to follow, strive for, and try to live up to. And then your remark is, this Jesus would not save you, but could inspire you to work harder.
Yeah, which is exactly what he needed. He was already working himself to exhaustion. He's like, oh, Jesus is telling me to work harder. Yeah, I mean, I found that such a fascinating moment. My doctorate, I focused on American religious history, and pretty much every account of 20th century religion, you get this divide between fundamentalist and modernist, or liberals and conservatives. And there's this huge rift, between the people who hold the old ways and insist on literalist readings of the Bible and all the miracles really happened, and people who sort of demythologize Christianity and something like that. And that's seen as such a pivotal thing. And Nixon crosses that line in college, which many people do. And goes, the class is structured very consciously as taking fundamentalists and making them into modernist. And Nixon embraces that as a college student. Yes, I used to be a fundamentalist. I don't know that his church was that fundamentalist. Right. That's how he perceived it at the time. I used to be a fundamentalist. He says, I even used to believe Jonah and the whale, and now I know better. So he charts this, or he follows this well-trod path. But then when you look at this super important thing in his life, and the thing that the theological struggle that's at the core of him and is underneath every success that he has for the rest of his political career and every failure, it's this belief about grace and works, and that is totally untouched by this supposedly so important division. When he believes that Jesus is really God and raises from the dead, he doesn't believe in grace. And when he believes that he's a noble example about the fatherhood of God and brotherhood of man, this kind of liberal social justice-y thing, he doesn't believe in grace. So it doesn't touch him where he needs to be touched either way.
Yeah. Well, an image that you return to often is his father, this very, very hard man, who owned a grocery store, but the grocery store was a converted, well, I guess it was a gas station grocery store. It was a converted church, and his office was in the steeple. And so, this what used to be a church is now this place of commerce. And then there's the very hard and difficult father looking down from the steeple to make sure the boys are tending to their business and not goofing off.
To me, this was actually kind of the start of the book, this image. I as a historian was reading a lot of 20th century history, and Nixon comes up a lot. Whatever 20th century topic you care about, Nixon's there. Civil rights, Vietnam, Cold War, the transformation of the evolution of the Republican Party and American conservatism. Nixon's a huge, important figure. And so I'm reading about him, and I keep finding this random image in biographies of him in this church with his father up above, scowling at him and accusing him of not working hard enough and berating him for not being a hard enough worker. And I'm like, I think that feels like the key. Like that's not a sort of an interesting detail, That to me felt like sort of a central image that would actually work as an interpretive lens on the rest of Nixon's life.
Yeah. And then his earliest memory of his mother, now I'm drawing a blank on what it was, but that seems striking too.
It's his earliest memory, all told. His earliest memory is of his mother driving a buggy, and he fell off. He fell off the horse and carriage, and as a child, didn't believe his mother would stop to get him, and so he gets up and starts running, and that's his first memory. And he actually has a scar on his forehead his whole life from this incident, and combs his hair the way he does in particular to hide the scar.
Wow.
Which is a very revealing moment in one of his autobiographies, that he's like, my first memory is about this thing that wounded me forever, but I'm going to hide from you and hide my entire life.
Wow.
An important part of that relationship with his mother is that she is very devout. She's very quiet. She's sort of the opposite of his father, who's loud and argumentative and blustery. She's very quiet and gentle and reserved, and everyone kind of refers to her as a saint. But she doesn't like to show emotion. She considers emotion sloppy, even emotion of a mother for a child. So Nixon tells us that his mother never said she loved him. And he hurries to add, and of course she didn't need to. We just all knew that she loved us. But he's already told me that he lies about scars that he has. So I had reason to maybe doubt that quick denial. And I just sort of can't really believe that it didn't matter, that she never verbalized it. She verbalized her expectations that he would work hard. She verbalized her expectations that he would perform and do better and live up to her expectations and fulfill her dreams for him. But she didn't verbalize that it was good that he existed and that she loved him just the way he was. And that's along with that theological education and the angry dad scowling at you from the top of the church, it seems like it really formed a man.
It sounds like also his parents were willing to articulate their love for, he had two brothers who died, and they were, willing to sentimentalize and I hate to use that language when it's somebody else's child who's died, but say things like, it's too bad it's always the good ones who die, isn't it?
Yeah. That was his father in particular who said the good ones always go first, which is, I mean, in tragedy we say things, but it wounded Nixon. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. This is a podcast about the creative process, the writing process, but still, I got one other thing we got to talk about before we get to some of those questions, and that is, I was so fascinated with the Alger Hiss. Can you give us a quick run? I mean, probably most of our readers don't know exactly. Some of our listeners don't know exactly who Alger Hiss is.
Sure.
But the whole Alger Hiss thing and the way the Quakerism worked into that, it's just fascinating to me.
Yeah, so Nixon runs for Congress after serving in World War II, wins, and ends up embracing the Cold War as a sort of chief concern, that there's this sort of world historic struggle between the Christian West and the atheist communist East, and specifically concerned about communist spies in the U.S. seeking to subvert the U.S. And he gets a place on a congressional committee that was quite famous and quite controversial, called the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC for short.
Didn't want to be on that committee, did he?
People might know Joe McCarthy and McCarthyism, if that rings a bell. He was in the Senate version of that committee. This was the House version.
Oh,
okay. Same thing. And yeah, they would investigate communism in the United States, and it was kind of a mess of a committee. But during one sort of ramshackle, badly run hearing, there's a former communist spy, self-confessed communist spy named Whittaker Chambers, who testifies before the committee, who currently, at the time that he testifies, he's actually an editor for Time magazine, a quite conservative magazine, and he's had a kind of whole conversion experience, and he's no longer a communist and is now actually like willing to sacrifice his life and reputation to oppose communism because he's had this conversion experience. And he's literally become a Quaker. So that's a first sort of trigger of recognition, is that his political conversion comes along with this religious conversion, and he has become a Quaker. Though the one sort of concern he has about Quakerism is the pacifism, because he thinks like fighting communism might be too important for this peace testimony, which Nixon is already not so committed to the pacifism. So they kind of connect on that level, and they both, Nixon feels like there's a ring of truth in this testimony. And when other people are eager and over eager to dismiss Whittaker Chambers' testimony for kind of a whole bunch of reasons, they're sort of like, I don't know, this guy just talks. He seems kind of shaggy and wrinkled and weird and mumbly, and I don't know if he's telling the truth. And one of the people he accuses, in particular, who he says, when I was a spy, I was working with this guy and was getting secrets from a guy in government and passing them along to Soviet Russian authorities, was a guy named Alger Hiss. And Alger Hiss was kind of the opposite of poor, neglected son of a gas station attendant, Richard Nixon, and the opposite of, shaggy, wrinkled, disrespected Whittaker Chambers. Alger Hiss came from the best schools and the best families and was friends with the best people and very much like the elite. So it was a little bit hard to believe for most people that he was really a communist. This is someone who like worked alongside Franklin Delano Roosevelt and had super important positions and ran a very prestigious think tank, and it just didn't make sense. But Nixon believed it, and decided to pursue the case against Alger Hiss, and becomes a communist hunter going after Alger Hiss in particular. And manages to not, he isn't at the time able to prove that Hiss is a communist, but he is able to prove that Hiss is lying. So he gets him on perjury and is able to say that like he's being deceptive. One of these men is truthful and one of these men is being deceptive. And that's the one way that we can decide who to believe. The other really weird detail in this story is that Hiss's wife is also a Quaker, and Hiss is not a convert, but goes to one of these very liberal Quaker meetings, and
I thought Hiss was a convert.
Language, so there's actually 3 Quakers in this story,
it's wild.
Which is another example of, it's mostly told as a political story, as a conflict between communist and anti-communist, and that it is that, but it also has these deep religious resonances once you start paying attention to them. Yeah, which is what I'm trying to do in the book, is listen to all of those tones as well. Yeah,
well, it's so interesting that you draw the connections between Nixon choosing to believe, or not should say believing Whittaker Chambers, because he was used to the idea of, I know the slick urbane world, tells these lies loud, but truth is quiet, and it's something that God says quietly, and Chambers seems like a guy who could hear that truth, and then there was also that clue that because Whittaker Chambers could talk to them about, he had heard the Mrs. Hiss use the thee and thou. Only somebody who was close to that family would have ever heard that, and that's something
because that Quaker use of language. So there was sort of an older Quakerism where people didn't use you when talking to each other, but used the and Nixon recognized that religious detail from his own life and knew that someone who knew that would really know this person. Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and gets lost in all sorts of details, including like bird watching habits and who sold a car when, and it's a wild ride.
It really is. I mean, we all know about Watergate, and we know about the debate with Kennedy, and there are these famous moments, and the Alger Hiss story is quite a famous moment too. But it was the one of the big ones I knew the least about, so I just loved reading about it in your book. Okay, so on to writerly questions.
Love it.
Did you learn to love Richard Nixon in this process?
No.
Really?
But I think it's complicated. I think the reasons that I don't like Richard Nixon are also the reasons I don't like myself.
Yeah.
So it became very, I guess from the beginning, it was a very personal, and my emotional relationship to him was very personal. But I sought as a writer to extend empathy to him, not as someone who loved him, but as someone who was frustrated, discouraged, disgusted by his choices. And I kind of thought, well, if I can find empathy for him at his worst, then I can find empathy for myself in those same spaces. Yeah. So that might be a kind of love, but I didn't walk away being like, man, he's the best. He's so, you know what I mean? Like, he's still, I at the end of writing it, I told my wife, I feel like I have the most well-constructed imaginary friend you could possibly have. You kind of live with this person for years and years, and I know the sound of his voice. I can imagine how he would respond to stuff. You do kind of have this imaginary friend, but he's not a fun imaginary friend. But he is someone that I have great empathy for and great sympathy for, and that I ended up feeling. I mean, I ended up even in writing the end, like hoping that he would eventually figure it out. Like, please get grace. This could be the moment. This could be the encounter. This could be the day. So it's a kind of love, but I would say it was especially, the experience of it was empathy and more than affection.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, I have known for a long time about all the self-pity and all the resentment and, all those worst aspects of his
instincts,
character. Yeah. But to see it put in theological terms was really helpful to me. It's like, I felt something that I think empathy is the right word. I mean, the self-pity and the resentment that is so detestable. Especially
it's really off-putting. Yeah.
But then to put it in terms of, it's a kind of theological mistake that I have been known to make my own self. Thankfully, it doesn't seem to have been, I don't think it's going to turn into the kind of full-blown,
quite as destructive
rottenness that he did. But
yeah, I was really hoping as a writer that people would find a way to see themselves. And, and if you're going to draw any sort of important theological lessons from your own life, you have to find him relatable. Yeah. And so finding a way, and that was part of the challenge of writing it, and part of the joy of the challenge of writing it was, how do I take these moments where he seems like the least likable major historical figure you could imagine, and how do I take them and find a way into them, and find a way, not to excuse it, not to justify it, but help people see themselves a little bit and go, oh man, that terrible thing, I totally do that.
Yeah.
Maybe I didn't bug the Watergate, but I have also been, there's a way he's like so fixated on his enemies and hates other people so much that doesn't hurt them at all, but hurts himself. Yeah, of course. We call that Tuesday where I live. That's just a thing that we do. And the reason you work on resentment or anger or brooding is because, hey, it doesn't hurt. It's not out of, great love for the people who are, mean to you or hurt you. It's because, this will do a number on you yourself. And you gotta learn to let stuff go for that reason. But I hope that people find themselves in Nixon. I at least did.
Yeah. All right, before we started recording, I asked, did you do interviews for this? And then I realized, no, you didn't do interviews because everybody's dead, or not, I don't guess everybody's dead.
They're not quite all dead, but many of them are dead. Yeah, many of them.
You weren't interviewing anybody about Alger Hiss.
No. But even if I had the chance, I probably would have skipped it. For a couple of reasons. One, there's lots and lots of documentary evidence. I mean, the Nixon archive in Yorba Linda, the presidential library, has done lots of interviews over the years. So there's sort of oral histories. That work has kind of already been done. Also, like, so many people, he's such a famous person that so many people wrote stuff down. At one point I thought, man, has everybody who ever met this guy written a memoir about it? Like, he had a doctor who treated him who wrote a memoir called like Healing Nixon. And a guy raised some money for his legal defense after he resigned the presidency. That guy wrote a memoir about that in particular. One of his daughters wrote a memoir. Almost everybody on his staff wrote a memoir. Pat Buchanan wrote 2 memoirs about working for Nixon. Nixon himself wrote 3 memoirs. There's just piles and piles of stuff.
Okay.
And then of course there's also lots of archival evidence from the time. And I read at one point, one of my favorite files in the archives was every memo that Nixon had ever written. Just a pile and pile and pile. And they read like emails. There's no they're just dashed off to people you work with every time. So there's no like, dear sir, I hope this finds you well. It's all just goes immediately to the point. And they say things like, hey, whatever happened to Eisenhower's cleats? And that's the whole memo. And you're like, I don't know what that's about. On to the next one. But I ended up deciding that I trusted that stuff more. Stories have a way of calcifying, and people find their way to various self-justifications, or sort of the interpretations harden. Yeah. And I was really interested in stuff that was recorded and put down as close to the event as possible. One of the most fascinating sets of documents in that sense was there was a historian at California State Fullerton, the university there, who in the 70s trained a bunch of students how to do oral histories, and just wanted to teach them to do oral histories, and thought, well, like, what's a historical import around here? Oh, the president of the United States grew up down the road. And so his students go and interview like Nixon's cousins and his Sunday school teacher and the pastor of his church, and just anybody who knew him as a kid. And those are great. And I got a lot of the stuff about his childhood and his parents actually from those interviews, and got a really different perspective than like Nixon in his memoir, where he's crafting it a little bit more carefully. But an amazing thing that happens in the middle of those interviews, the Watergate stuff starts coming out. So you actually, as you're reading the documents, you see people go, yeah, Nixon grew up here, and that's why he's such a great leader, and he's such a noble person. And then and then there's like a month later, people are going, I don't know when he went wrong. It had nothing to do with us. He must have picked that up somewhere else. And so people are in real time kind of rethinking things. And I just didn't think that 50 years later, or probably 40 years later, or 30 years later, that people would quite have the fresh memory to kind of re-examine what they knew and what they remembered.
Yeah, that is so interesting. As I was reading, I was reading like a Kindle advanced reading copy version, and having a hard time seeing the footnotes. So I was kind of curious where some of this stuff was coming from. But some of the things I was wondering about are obviously from those interviews that you're talking about with the locals.
Gotta love the archivists who save all those things and make
Yeah.
them available. Even during COVID, I was able to email one of the archivists and go, can you just like send these to me? And they did.
Really?
We really
Just
depend.
scandals
Historians so much depend on those people.
Yeah.
You know, read a lot of old newspaper articles too. So many old newspapers have been digitized. That was a wonderful source of, you know, when he was running for Congress, when he was even a couple of articles from when he was in high school. And then, of course, on through the Senate and vice president and president, finding firsthand accounts of stuff that happened. It's great,
Yeah.
great.
Well, and the opening, you know, you start with this strange moment where he's praying with Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
The two people I wasn't
Lincoln bedroom.
expecting to be, you know, kneeling and praying together.
They both seemed quite surprised. Nixon literally says, you know, Henry, you're not a very good Jew, and I'm not a very good Quaker, but we need to pray.
Yeah. And, you know, and then there's also the moment where he says, be sure not to tell anybody that this happened. And he's like, I won't, but he's already told, you know.
Yeah, that was originally reported by Woodward and Bernstein, the great Watergate reporters. So they did a follow-up book called The Last Days of Richard Nixon. And it's clear in retrospect that one of their sources was one of the 2 or 3 men on Kissinger's staff who told him about that moment. But then it's confirmed, you know, so a lot of times at the time, people were like, I don't know if I believe this. You know, there's one source and maybe he made it up. But it ends up being confirmed in substance, both by Kissinger in his own, you know, very long and ponderous memoir. It's like over 1,000 pages. And by Nixon. You know, they quibble about some of the details, but substantively, they all 3 sources end up telling the same story where he, you know, they disagree about whether he cried, but they all agree that he was sort of overcome in that final moment and decided to pray and asked his Holocaust surviving, non-practicing Jewish national security advisor to get down on his knees in the Lincoln bedroom and pray with him in that moment of crisis.
So many surprising little moments that are so vivid that you really bring to life. So just love what you do in this book. It's I think you just added a lot to certainly my understanding of of a story that I kind of knew but didn't really. I mean, as you know, I've been following Richard Nixon since I was a very small person, and my earliest memory, as I said before, but not really following him, but. I've just always been so fascinated with him, but there's so much in here that I did not know. So thank you.
That's an interesting challenge as a writer too. Like, presidents are not obscure figures, and people have strong and fixed opinions of them. So finding a way to challenge and complicate and nuance and what people think they already know, and in some cases do already know. It's different than writing. So often you're writing about someone that no one's never heard of, or if you're a fiction writer, you're making up a character and you get to kind of form it. And one of the challenges of a biography of a famous person is to sort of you're meeting the reader's expectations, and they're already sort of partially formed, which is it's an interesting writerly problem. Yeah.
And if you completely meet my expectations, I think, why did I read this at all?
You don't need it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also have to like convince you because you know some things. And if I present you confident, suave hero, Nixon, who has no social anxiety, you would have been like, that doesn't sound right to me. And that's not what I recall, but yeah.
All right. Well, let me ask you one other question. I should have given you a warning, but I didn't. But I usually end these conversations with a question. Who are the writers that make you want to write?
Oh, interesting. Currently or historically?
I think currently.
Okay. I mean, I think growing up, I would say John Steinbeck was the person who kind of blew me away, and simultaneously, like, reading him changed how I see the world, and also like connected in a way with how I had already. It was like there was a sort of moment of recognition. I was sort of, wait, that's right. That is what I'm seeing when I look out at people around me, and what life is like. And that's kind of amazing. But more currently, writers who really move me. I mean, I really love, in terms of history and biography, I think Robert Caro is probably impossible to beat. He's such an amazing writer. He's doing a 5-volume Lyndon Johnson biography, and he's really does amazing research, and that's part of what I love about him. You know, he sort of knows every single detail. He's been working on Lyndon Johnson for longer than Lyndon Johnson was president. But maybe more than that is his ability to create scenes and use the art of writing as a almost as a fiction writer to tell a story and set a scene and give you an image and let that convey the story. And there are, just scenes from those biographies that are kind of indelible. They just, once you read them, you're like, I'm never gonna forget that picture that I have in my mind. And I can interpret that picture, and Robert Caro interprets that picture, but the story makes it so memorable. Another historian that people have heard less of that I really admire and always feel like I learned from is a guy named Paul Johnson. He does a micro history that I just love called Sam Patch, the Famous Jumper. And it's about this guy in the kind of Jacksonian era who got famous, becomes kind of a celebrity for jumping into waterfalls.
Okay.
And it's this kind of like daredevil, Evel Knievel-y stunt. And we don't know that much about Sam Patch, but he was kind of famous in his day. But there's just this like handful of accounts. But he's able to kind of investigate each detail and build it out and explain what's really going on and turn this kind of wisp of a historical figure into this study of aesthetics and labor and the conflict between the mill owners and mill workers and the emerging democratic idea of manhood. And it's all so carefully constructed, and yet also this sort of amazing story that picks up this detail that I think most people would go, hey man, that's funny. This guy named Sam Patch used to jump into waterfalls and people would come out and watch, and it was like a whole scene. But he's like, yes, and also that carries the whole world, and I really love that.
Yeah, great. Well, Daniel Silliman, thank you so much. It's been so fun to talk, and love your book, and I hope a lot of people read it.
Thanks. It was great to be here.
The Habit Podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. You can support their work, including this podcast, by becoming a member. Visit rabbitroom.com/membership. Special thanks as well to Taylor Leonard for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for the Habit Podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorleonard.com. The Habit Membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.